These are the recorded lectures for Chapter 23, 23.5, and 23.6 on the seed plants. Seed plants all of them are vascular plants. So they are vascular plants that use seeds during the dispersal phase of their life cycle. So, excuse me, the part of their life cycle where the seeds are dispersed by wind or animals, that part is called the dispersal phase. Okay, so the seeds contain a sporophyte embryo, and what that means is that once the embryo begins to grow or germinate, it will grow into the sporophyte generation of the plant. So the seeds contain the sporophyte embryo and stored food within a protective seed coat. These are the three parts of a seed: the embryo, stored food, and the seed coat. And both the seed coat and the stored food allow the embryo to survive harsh conditions. Once a seed germinates, the stored food is a source of nutrients for the growing seedling. And survival of the seeds largely accounts for the dominance of seed plants today. So we have two groups of seed plants, and they are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Both are heterosporous. That means they have microspores and megaspores. The microspores are the male gametes, and then the megaspores are the female. Unlike other plant groups, seed plants retain the spores rather than release them into the environment. Remember, your mosses and your ferns, the mosses came from the phylum Bryophyta, and the ferns came from the phylum Pteridophyta. Both of those release spores and don't produce seeds. Now, the microspores become the male gametophytes, and you will need to know the male gametophytes for the seed plants are actually the pollen grains. The male gamete is a sperm, but the gametophyte, which is the structure that is haploid, the haploid generation in the alternation of generations life cycle, that male gametophyte is the pollen grain. Pollination is when the pollen lands on the flower or lands, it's not always a flower, but lands on the female gametophyte. Fertilization is when the sperm actually reaches the egg, but the pollination part occurs when the wind or a pollinator, like an animal, carries pollen to the female gametophyte. And once the pollen reaches the female gametophyte, the sperm move toward the female gametophyte and toward the egg through a pollen tube. So a tube grows from the pollen, and the sperm are carried through that tube to the ovule or the egg. It says the megaspore develops into a female gametophyte within an ovule, which becomes a seed following fertilization. No external water is needed to accomplish fertilization. So this is true for the seed plants, not for the bryophytes. I can't think of it, lycophytes and pteridophytes. Now, the gymnosperms are mostly cone-bearing seed plants. In the gymnosperms, the ovules are not completely enclosed by sporophyte tissue at the time of pollination. Gymnosperm actually means naked seed. Gymno means naked and sperm means seed. So that means that the seed is not enclosed by a fruit. But angiosperms are the flowering plants, and that term means covered seed. and in which case the ovules are completely enclosed within the diploid sporophyte tissue called the ovary, which once it ripens becomes a fruit. So when you eat fruit like an apple, you are eating a ripened ovary. So we will start by covering the gymnosperms. In the gymnosperms, the seeds are not enclosed by a fruit. They are naked seeds. There are 1,000 species divided into 4 extant groups, and that just means that they're not extinct. They're in existence today. The 4 groups of gymnosperms, the most common group is the conifers. That's going to be where you have like your pine trees. They're the most plentiful. But then we have cycads, ginkgos, and gnetophytes. Conifers, cycads, ginkgos, and gnetophytes. The conifers produce cones. They also have tough needle-like leaves. The tough needle-like leaves of pine trees conserve water. They have a thick cuticle and recessed stomata. The sporophyte is dominant, and what that means, the recessed stomata is just helping to conserve water. The sporophyte is dominant, as it is with all of the plants besides the bryophytes. The pollen grains are wind-blown. The seed is the dispersal stage. And conifers are monoecious. Monoecious means a single plant produces both pollen and seed cones. The pollen cone is the male reproductive structure. The seed cone is the female reproductive structure. So when we look at a pine tree, here's a picture. Let's blow it up. When we look at a pine tree, a pine cone, that is the female cone. When it's enclosed and those scales are not open like that, when it's younger and the scales are flat and the cone is, smaller, there are actually pine seeds inside of there. And people cook with them. Sometimes people cook with them, and I know they can be used to make pesto. Now, up at the top left, you see male cones, and you will see those on a different part of the tree. But particularly in the spring, you'll start to see them. But the male cones and the female cones look very different from one another. The male cones are where you find the pollen, and then the female cones are where the eggs are, or the ovules, which are fertilized and then become seeds. So let's go back. So that is why we call these conifers monoecious, because they do have the male and the female cones on the same plant. Here you have a picture of pine trees. The state tree of North Carolina is the loblolly pine. Then we have spruce trees, which are often used as Christmas trees, and then the juniper. The life cycle of the pine tree, we can begin with the pollen cones and the seed cones. We'll just start up here with number 1. Number 1, the pollen cones, they develop near the tips of lower branches. So near the tips of lower branches, you can see them real easily when they do start developing. And then the seed cones are larger, and they develop near the tips of higher branches, and then they tend to fall off whenever the seeds have developed. Number 2, the pollen sacs. A pollen cone has 2 pollen sacs that lie on the underside of each scale. And then the seed cone has 2 ovules that lie on the upper surface of each scale. You can see 1 pollen sac here and 1 ovule here, but there are 2 for each scale on the cones. All right, within the pollen sac and the ovule, meiosis occurs, and that produces the sperm and the ovules. similar to humans, within that megaspore, that female structure, only one of the 4 cells that's produced by meiosis will actually become an ovule. Only one of those survives to become an ovule or egg. For the pollen, which is carried by the wind, well, here I just want you to look. There's 2 wings, and it helps the pollen get carried by the wind to the female, to the ovule. Okay, so in step 5, you have meiosis occurs, and there's 1 egg for every instance of meiosis. Every cell that divides produces 1 egg instead of 4. In step 6, once a pollen grain reaches a seed cone, it becomes a mature male gametophyte. Remember that one, because that is a question on your practice test. What is the male gametophyte for the gymnosperms and the angiosperms? And it is the pollen grain. So what happens is a pollen tube grows toward the female gametophyte and discharges not 1 but 2 sperm. And they are non-flagellated. They don't have flagella, but 2 sperm instead of 1. One of the sperm fertilizes the egg and a zygote results. And then if you go to step 7, it doesn't tell you what the second sperm does. All right, so a zygote results from one of them. It doesn't say, so don't worry about it. So one of the 2 sperm fertilizes the egg and it becomes a zygote, and then it will grow into a seed which contains the embryo, the seed coat, and the stored food. All right, conifers have medicinal value. Their needles and bark are rich in vitamins A and C, and they can be used to create teas that ease the symptoms of a cold or cough. There's other uses listed here too. And then we move on from the conifers to the cycads. The biggest thing about the cycads is they have very large, like single cone. Like it would just be like 1 cone, and the cone can be more than 1 meter long, like the length of a yardstick or a meter stick. Unlike the conifers, the pollen and seed cones are on separate plants, and that word is dioecious. And cycads are pollinated by insects rather than the wind. This is a picture of an African cycad. Very pretty, very ornamental. And look at the cone. These cones can be huge, and you normally just have a 1 or very few. Then we have the ginkgos. The only surviving species is called Ginkgo biloba. Ginkgos are also dioecious. Some trees produce seeds and others produce pollen. Ginkgos are native to China, and in Asia, the ginkgo seeds are considered a delicacy. The extracts from the Ginkgo biloba plant have been used to improve blood circulation. And you can see the seed, and you can see how the leaves kind of look. The last of the 4 groups of conifers is the gnetophytes. The gnetophytes are known for producing ephedra or ephedrine, which is a medicine that's extracted from the ephedra plant. And another really interesting plant is the Welwitschia plant. That is a gnetophyte that only has 2 huge leaves, and it can live for, you can Google this if you want to, but I mean literally like 1,000 years. They live very, very long. So This is showing you one of the leaves. It's just looks like more leaves because it's all folded and wrapped around itself. But this is the Welwitschia, which lives a very long time and has 2 leaves. The Gnetophytes, it doesn't say if they're dioecious or monoecious, so it doesn't really matter if you know that. But the 2 examples of the Gnetophytes are the ephedra and the Welwitschia, and this is the ephedra plant. This is the Welwitschia. And then we're going to move on to angiosperms, and that'll be the next recording.